What I'm going to do is just show you a series of pictures. My work is all about geographical variations, how where you live alters your life chances and how that's changed over time. Thanks to Melinda Kerrison, who's here, I'm going to be able to show you some data that you already know, but I think is well worth just looking at again over the increase in numbers who are imprisoned and who they are and so on. And that's my excuse, or my token, for being more related to this conference. But then what I really want to show you are 10 maps about the variation in young people's lives in this country today. I still think it's staggering to look at this particular graph, which is such a well-known graph. It has still reached an all-time high, despite what Ken Clark says. I think the Barrow Cadbury Trust is 70 years old, could be corrected. 90, okay. Yes, so well, if you go back 90 years, I think they would have been shocked to see that. And I think it's worth our while reminding ourselves constantly that we have the highest imprisonment rate in Western Europe, that there is a very good correlation between inequality and imprisonment. There's a very good correlation between the age of criminal responsibility and inequality. The more unequal countries have a lower age of criminal responsibility. The country which imprisons most people in the world is Rwanda, but if you exclude the war criminals, then it's the United States, and then we are one of the highest. I put this up because I just want to show you what happens if you change a few scales. That's a log scale, which allows you to look at change over time. And when it's a straight line on the log scale, that means it's going up at a constant rate. But the long-term trend is still this constant rate for men of higher rates of imprisonment. Now, if you look at the change over time year by year, the next one, it looks pretty random. But if we alter the scale for women on the other axis so that it's similar for men, there was a graph earlier doing the same kind of thing, you'll see that the two track each other. But there's a divergence at the end, which I think, well, is as significant as the divergence that occurred during the Second World War. And I don't know much about imprisonment in the Second World War, but I suspect there were conscientious objectors and other men being interned. But something odd is happening recently. At the very beginning, Anna said about how a third of people 18 to 24 in the criminal justice system, a slightly smaller proportion end up being imprisoned, particularly since the drop. But the drop partly occurred because there just wasn't enough prison places to put younger people in, because we were putting so many only slightly older people into our prisons. If you turn those absolute numbers into rates, you see it becomes younger. That 7 per thousand, if you take it up by a third, goes up to 1%. 1% of young people being imprisoned, and of course it's come down now, but it's incredibly high. If we go forward again, putting women on the same scale as a ratio and then turning that up again, then you get that same age curve that you see so many times for the proportion of girls and women who are in our prisons by the very latest numbers that we were able to get, which was the 2009, and then going forward again to absolute numbers. And then taking that down, and the reason I'm going to take this down is, if we were, rather than being one of the worst countries in Western Europe, one of the best countries in Western Europe, you'd be looking at something that was dropping that much. Right. This is a very strange country. And if you live in this very strange country, in a country which has become more strange, it's hard to appreciate that because, of course, for you it is normal. Now the maps. Over the last 32 years, we've had constant increases in key polarisation measures, most importantly in wealth and health. So when I was growing up as a young lad, areas were much more similar to each other, people had much more similar trajectories. My mum and dad, who were relatively posh, had me at much the same age as everybody else did, because you had your kids in their 20s and so on. There's much less variety. There's now much more variety. We have much better data we can practically track all young people from the age of 15 forward. This is just showing you it for Sheffield. So that's the town I live in. Those two areas at the bottom are two halves of Nick Clegg's constituency. And those are the two parts of Sheffield where your most likely outcome as a young person is to go to university. This data is a few years old. The orange areas for the other 5 constituencies, all split in half, are where the most likely outcome was a full-time job. The two colours differ because if you're in my part of the Hallam constituency, I'm not quite rich enough to live in the other half, you're most likely to go to the University of Derby. We can get it down this accurately, street by street, but not just about going to university. This is the second most likely thing to occur to young people by the age of 21, given where they lived at 15. That is David Blunkett's constituency, largely, which is coloured green, bright side, where the second most largest outcome was unemployment. Now, those greens have now spread across Sheffield to become the first most likely outcome for many young people in the poorest areas, and certainly the second in much of the rest. The yellow, the apprenticeships, that's now moved to a more affluent area because children who are not going to be going to university are now taking up apprenticeships and so on. But we can monitor these things almost tragically at a point when we're going to be monitoring outcomes that are going to be pretty bad. That's what we're fairly sure. Europe, just to say we really do need to think about making European comparisons. We're a large chunk of Europe. My reason for putting up this map, which I've now just remembered, is the maps are stretched. I'm going to be showing you. And I'm completely used to stretching things, but many of you will not have seen one of these maps before. This to me looks like a normal map, but of course to you it probably looks weird. Okay? Right. I have my screensaver for the last 5 years has been the map of the world like this. Area on this map is proportional to people. Okay? The amount of area is proportional to people. So we are a big chunk of Europe. Finland and Norway are small areas. France is large. You can see Madrid in the middle of Spain. If you're very quick learners, you've got the idea. And you're going to need to be quick learners because I've got about 3 minutes left to go through the maps of Britain. That's exactly the same, almost exactly the same pattern that I showed you for Sheffield, but for the country as a whole. And the reason for putting this up is to tell you there are incredibly different fortunes now for young people growing up in different constituencies and in different halves of the constituency. When I was young, for men, it was a job. Abuse weird men like me might go to university. I went to a normal school, an average school, which meant just 6 of us went to university out of 300, and we were the strange ones. You could achieve well. We now have a much wider variety of outcomes. These are the 12, and I won't go into them. The red areas towards me are where you're most likely to go to a Russell Group university. Remember, a third or more of young people now go to university. 51% of young women go to university in Britain. It is not elitist to talk about going to university anymore. It's actually the norm for girls to go to university. But if you're in that red area, you're heading to a Russell Group university. If you're in the purple, posh parts of London, you're going elite. If you're in the grey area, you're other. In other words, NEET is your most likely outcome, taking out the national average. I'll go very quickly through these. I talked about when my parents had me. We're now bimodal in age distribution of when we have our children. You either have your children in your 20s or in your late 30s or even early 40s, depending on which social class you are in now. The pink areas are where it is normal to have your children in your 30s, and the green areas where it's normal, the majority of people become parents in their early 20s. So you see you get these huge differences. These are averages for parliamentary constituencies. Go forward. This is an estimate of the wealth of children. We take all the wealth of an area, the housing wealth, the positive equity, the actual money as far as we can estimate it, and we just assume that all the adults die, and then say, what would you be left with? And the wealth is polarised dramatically. Much more, these figures are slightly out of date now. In Kensington, the average property in Kensington is 1.2 million. The average terraced house in Kensington is 2.9. Semi is 3.1 million, a detached house is 7 million. It's a small group of children, but there are a significant and growing group of young adults in Britain who can expect to inherit an awful amount of money because there's less of them and the money is going down to them like this. On the other hand, for those children who live in the constituencies where there is much less money and of course whose parents don't own any property and so on, inheritance will be tiny, and we know that the cuts are taking £2,000 off them on top of this. Qualification differences, I mean, just look at the scale. That's all I really wanted to put this up. There are some areas where the proportion, large areas, half constituencies these are, less than 2% of children have no qualification when they leave school, and other areas where it's over a third. I've got no time to show you this. This all comes from an atlas done with Beth and Thomas called Cradle to Grave Atlas, where we looked at what's normal at different ages across the country. But young people have different aspirations and expectations in different places because they're realistic. Social class by children of their parents. The ultimate reason for me showing you this is just as the speaker earlier this morning said, you cannot take your own childhood, if you're my age, and project it back and talk about young people today using your own experiences. You also, if you happen to be a bit older than me, can't take your children's experiences and use that as a good model anymore, because your children will not be normal, because there is no longer any normal. The variation in life chances is now so wide across the country. You even see the pattern here in illness rates. The blue areas are where children of these ages, this is 16 and young adults, 16 to 24-year-olds are unlikely to be suffering from limited long-term illness or poor health. The red areas is where already they're more likely to say they're suffering from this, and you'll see the geography to these patterns emerging. And the major reason is poor mental health. That is the major thing which is now, and almost for good reason. I mean, part of a measure of poor mental health is that you don't look forward to the future. Okay. My final 3 slides concern young people who don't make it into adulthood. I work in a variety of areas, and it was interesting to me at the beginning that people were talking about the improvement there's been and the third fall. One of the areas that I look at is road traffic accidents, where there's also been a fall in recent years, and some people celebrate this. But road traffic accidents are still the major killer of people between the ages of 5 and 29 in this country. And I've just put in these last slides up to sort of step back a bit and to sort of say what things, because of course, these are 16-year-olds who die not from a disease, 11 to 16-year-olds. And most of them, it's a crime that's been involved in their killing. And when you all put your hands up when John Stowe asked you had you been involved in the crime, I won't ask you to put your hand up now if it was speeding. But we forget these things. These are all the causes of death of 17 to 19-year-olds in Britain for the very latest data we have. Just to show you how big a proportion of the harm we cause is caused by ourselves with driving a ton of metal through streets. It's partly because we've become so good at curing other diseases that cars are now such a big factor. Pedal cycles, by the way, is tiny because young people of these ages no longer cycle. And I think this should be my last image. But there are many things to think about wider than just the criminal justice system if you're worried about the harm that happens to people, and young people in particular. And I'll hand over now.